Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/122, and you can email the show, pedalshift@pedalshift.net, or call the voicemail hotline 202-930-1109, and you can check Pedalshift out at all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 122nd edition of the Pedalshift Project. These 2-a-week pods are starting to make the numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger, which is kind of fun and exciting. By the way, I'm Tim Mooney, your host. Good to see you all here again. We're taking yet another break. This will be the last break for Missouri and the Kiddie Trail Adventure, and the final chapters will be all in a row starting with the next episode. So you're going to get the final chapters of the Kiddie Trail Adventure. There's a lot of interesting stuff still to come. So if you thought it was starting to wind down, I'm here to tell you, it continued. The adventures continued. On this episode, we've got a fun conversation with Annalisa Vandenberg, who you remember from February's episode with her, and Erik Douds, her teammate, her companion, her co-rider, and what they're going to be doing in Alaska. It seems to be that we're doing lots of Alaska rides, but there's actually one other thing that has in common with Ella's episode from a couple of episodes back. So stay tuned for the thing that they have in common, which I thought was kind of fun. I discovered it actually in the middle of the interview. So fun project that they have going on with Miles of Portraits. So stay tuned for that. I wanted to give a quick shout out to anyone who's looking at doing the C&O trail this spring. Those of you who are relatively new to the show, you haven't heard a lot about it, me talking about the Chesapeake and Ohio towpath, but that's here in my backyard. It starts here in Washington, D.C. and goes all the way out to Cumberland, Maryland. It's really great. It's one of the great bicycle touring trails, attractions, whatever you want to call it, in the United States. And it's got a couple of problems with it right now, as it so frequently does. In addition to the Pawpaw Tunnel closure, which I know a lot of folks have been dealing with, we've had a series of crazy spring thunderstorms, and one of them created flooding that actually made the news that you probably saw, that flooded out this one town that's north of DC. But in addition to flooding that town out, it really hit the trail hard in a weird spot near Brunswick, Maryland. And if you're even a little bit familiar with it, it's near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. It's on the Maryland side. It's on the trail side of the river. And I just caught a video of it from one of the listeners to the show put something up on the Facebook, and it was Preston, for those of you. Preston's a big C&O guy. And it is awful what has happened at that part of the trail. It's really washed out, and I don't know what the Park Service is going to do. It's also at kind of a lousy spot because it's around mile marker 50 or so. It sort of cuts the DC end off from the Amtrak stop in Harper's Ferry. So it's going to be really interesting to see what ends up happening with the C&O this spring and then into the summer. It looks like it could be possible that the Park Service could put some kind of a temporary crossing in that spot, but more likely they may be asking people to take kind of a lousy, dicey road route to get to Brunswick or to or from Brunswick, using some of the mountainy roads that are around that area. Not super compelling from a bicycle perspective. I know that a few people have speculated whether or not you can actually kind of roll your bike down into that gully and cross near the Calvert, which is, I'm sure, not kosher with the Park Service folks, but also, frankly, it looks really dicey down there. So it'll be really interesting to see what ends up happening from the Park Service perspective and from those of us in the bicycle touring community. I'll have a link in the show notes to check all of that out. It's always an adventure on the Chesapeake and Ohio, y'all. So, as I mentioned, on this episode, we're going to be chatting with Annalisa and Erik about their 1,000-mile bike trip in Alaska and their Miles of Portraits project that's going on with that. And we also touch on touring in the wild with type 1 diabetes, which both of them live with and work with throughout their bicycle touring. So, how do you deal with that on bike tour? Listen for more. I am happy to have not one, but two great guests on this episode. I've got Annalisa, who you remember from back in February of 2018, and Erik, and they are riding 1,000 miles in Alaska doing their Miles of Portraits project. Annalisa and Erik, welcome to the Pedalshift Project.
Thanks for having us, Tim. Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm super psyched to have you both here. When we last chatted, Annalisa, we touched on 4,000 Miles of Portraits. It was sort of at the end of the interview, and it was really cool. Can you do a quick recap for anybody that didn't get a chance to listen to that episode about what 4,000 Miles of Portraits was?
Sure. It was kind of inspired by the first cross-country trip that I did in 2008, where I just noticed that, like, one of my favorite parts of the trip was just the people that we met and kind of the kindness that we received. So this time around, when we biked across the country last year, I set out to photograph the people that I met along the way. And it kind of became this collection of faces from this cross-section of America that we biked through. And it's really just like a celebration of the ways that the bicycle brings people together and the people that you wouldn't have otherwise met, like driving a car on a highway. Because, yeah, biking just brings you through the back roads and enables you to meet so many more people. Also just because of, like, the nature of riding a loaded bicycle, I feel like there's literally no walls, so you're like more vulnerable, and people are like very interested in what you're doing. So you get to kind of turn the question around on them.
When you did a post recently on, I think it was one of the Facebook groups or something like that, I saw you sort of posed the question, hey, isn't it interesting how a touring bike can open up all sorts of conversations? And I thought that was a really good way to put it. Eric, what was sort of your experience with that in terms of meeting people with bicycle touring? Do you have any kind of like specific story that you think about when you've run into random person on the road and you've got the bicycle with all the panniers hanging off of it?
Oh, I had such a wonderful time. I'm a pretty inquisitive person by nature, and so a lot of times Annalisa and I would be riding side by side, but there'd be times where we chose a city as the rest place, so sometimes we'd be divided up for a night or two. And when I was alone, I found people really opened up to you, and so there was a particular time where Annalisa happened to do a century that day, but I got sidetracked exploring a small town that was restoring an opera house, like a historic opera house. And it was so fascinating. I went in there and someone bought me lunch, and then someone bought me dinner, and they were serving me wine. And then I was in the local newspaper, and I was like, how did all of this happen just because I happened to bike 5 miles off the route? And so there's a lot of fun stories like that.
That's amazing. And also just to have that kind of experience that is really born out of happenstance. I mean, you could have easily taken a different turn to go a different way, and you would have missed out on all that.
Oh, yeah. When people tell you about like a side adventure to take, I'm always one to opt for it. But they're like, this is worth it. You're like, well, especially on a trip across America where you have 4,000 miles, I'm like, what's an extra 20 or what's an extra 30? And it was always worth it.
It's so funny. And because so often, especially if you're at the end of a day and you're thinking, oh, there is this cool place that I could go to, but it's an extra 5 miles and I'm exhausted. Have you ever passed up on things because you're just like, you know what, this day, this time, this moment, I just can't do it?
I really regret not going to that opera house with Eric.
It sounds like it. Well, at least he did it, and now he's got something to hang over you whenever the two of you are going, well, we could go to this town, and then he could be just like, opera house.
Yeah.
The reaction to your original project, the original 4,000 Miles of Portraits, has spurred on sort of what seems to be kind of a natural thing, which is to just continue it, and you've rebranded it Miles of Portraits. Other than sort of expansion past the original tour, is there anything else that you hope to bring out of it in this kind of 2.0 version of it?
Yeah, so the reason why I renamed it Miles of Portraits is just because we want to take it around the world. And we found that it's just like the great way to kind of get to know a place. And so this time around, we're actually going to take the project to Alaska, where we're going to ride 1,000 miles there. But this time around, we really want to make something out of all these portraits. So that's kind of where the Kickstarter comes in. We'll be producing a magazine and a short film following the trip, just because we think it would be great to just have something to take away and like hold in your hands, and also just have that film to show the experience.
I know you've got a design background, Annalisa. Eric, do you have a filmmaking background, or it's one of those things we're all filmmakers now that we have our iPhones, but I'm curious if you've got kind of a background in that.
No, my background's actually in environmental policy, and I've had this very hobbyist approach to video making, and I've only been taking it more seriously in the last year. But I think it comes out of, one, the experiences of being a type 1 diabetic, and there's a lot of stuff there's a lot of nuances in our life that I think visually showing that to people would really teach them what this disease is like. But then also, like, the first thing I did out of college was help design a national park on the border of Ethiopia and South Sudan. And so I've been to some, like, pretty spectacular, crazy places where at the end of these trips, I want to be like, here's a 10 to 15 minute film so you can understand a little bit of what I actually just did the last, 3 months or 6 months or a year.
Is that kind of what you're thinking, that it's going to be a short piece that distills all of the best of the tour? Or do you think that there could be something more if you've got the right content from it?
I mean, of course, I'd love it to develop into something more, but the way I'm currently envisioning the film is a bit of the portraits being completely about other people and the film kind of tying in Annalisa and I's story, in terms of what we do day by day, how we actually know each other, the whole trip planning, and then going out there. And so people, and then having those other stories intertwined in it so people can be like, oh, that's how they met, that firehouse. That's how they met the farmer out there. That's how they met the trout fisherman, is because they're off, like, on this journey.
I think one of the more interesting elements of this trip, particularly as it fits into the Miles of Portraits, is that you're going to be in Alaska. I mean, yeah, newsflash, right? But you're like, we are? What? What about Alaska? Because Alaska fascinates me. I've been to 48 of the 50 U.S. states, and Alaska is one that I still haven't been to yet. So I'm just fascinated by it, not only from a bicycle touring perspective. I've talked about it on the show, but just also the different types of people that you can meet, because it truly is America's last frontier, and the types of folks who are up there have very different relationships with what they do during the day than, say, somebody sitting in Washington, D.C. or Boston or New York. So was that one of the reasons why you chose Alaska? And if not, why Alaska?
So I applied to Lael Wilcox's Lael Rides Alaska scholarship, and I kind of promised myself that I would go no matter what, even if I didn't get it, which I didn't get. But I just remember reading the application on Lael's blog, just describing riding in Alaska, like the fact that the roads are so quiet that they feel like bike paths. And that was like a line that really appealed to me, because there's something really alluring about just like the middle of nowhere and the freedom of it. And just the idea of like the middle of nowhere, instead of there being cornfields, there'll be mountains. Just like the freedom of it really appeals to me. And the fact that we get to ride like through the night.
Oh, absolutely.
The sun barely sets.
I don't know if Lael Wilcox listens to my podcast. I would love it if she did. I'm such a fanboy. But you're the second guest who applied for this and didn't get it, but is riding Alaska anyway. So I feel like that the show has kind of become rejects of the Lael Wilcox scholarship. But you guys are out there doing the adventure anyways, which is so dope, and I think that's really great. And it's just more testament to the kind of inspiration that she has towards bicycling and now Alaska, which is so great. I'm curious. I mean, have either of you ever been to Alaska before?
Nope, I haven't been there.
Okay, so my question for you then is, you presumably heard about we'll call it the special wildlife of Alaska. Bears and mosquitoes completely come to mind on two very different ends of the spectrum here. Have you thought about what kind of special gear you're going to be carrying in Alaska for a bicycle tour that maybe you weren't necessarily carrying for your cross-country adventures?
I think we definitely need to get some bear spray for sure. But it's another thing to just, like, it's one thing to carry bear spray, but I feel like we have to like have it on ourselves, because then there's no point in bringing it with us if you're not prepared. But yeah, someone also suggested that we put bells on our bikes. So I think there's a lot of planning that we have to do around that.
But an interesting challenge that Annalisa and I have. So we're both type 1 diabetics, and something we need on us pretty much 24 hours a day is some sort of sugar to treat a low blood sugar. So hypoglycemia is the technical term for it, but in general, that would mean us, sleeping with, general food of like apples or, some sugary substance. And so I think we might have to get creative, either if it's just through multiple airtight containers or what, because we usually sleep with something in the tent so we can treat that low blood sugar. But then we obviously have the bear.
Yeah, like is a bear bag enough?
It's not recommended to be sleeping with food in bear country. So yeah, well, it's interesting because that really does get to a question that I had for you too. And Erik, since you started talking about, maybe I can direct it to you, is that there are stretches in your ride, presumably. I don't know if you're going to be doing the Dalton, for instance, but there's a stretch of Dalton that I think is about 4 days of zero services, zero cell phone signals in particular. And it's straight up wilderness bear country. How do you see something like that impacting your ride, particularly when it comes to just your blood sugar monitoring, but also like you described, you could be waking up in the middle of the night and need to be able to get something to eat, and you're going to have to be going outside of your tent to your bear canister, maybe 50 yards away. How are you framing all of that as part of your prep?
I feel like we're going to have to do some experimentation. I mean, it's an interesting hypothetical situation of what happens, say, like kind of disaster strikes. Something for the normal cyclist is that water will kind of be their number one issue. For Annalisa and I think food is actually a higher priority item, because we have situations where if you don't have food in 15 minutes, like things can get worse very, like a lot quicker. And so that's where I think we'll need backups and think about ideas such as maybe having 2 bear bags, or like have a smaller bear bag, because there's going to be situations where we're going to want a little bit more resiliency, because not only being worried about water and other things like that, we really need to make sure that we have food so we can get out of any situation.
That's really interesting. I wonder if there's been other resources out there, because living with type 1 diabetes and these types of adventure scenarios have assuredly happened, whether in a backpacking context or something like that, those types of resources might be out there. And if they don't exist, you two would be a really great kind of jumping off point, the vanguards to creating a resource for dealing with bear country with type 1 diabetes. So that could be a huge, huge boon to people who want to do the type of Alaska adventure.
I think you hit the nail on the head.
Sometimes things don't exist and you have to make them, like, say, bicycle touring podcasts, just for instance. Do you have any specific goals for your ride and the project, or are you looking at this as kind of an organic journey and recording and photographing and filmmaking, just sort of what comes? Or do you kind of have, we want to get this many people, we want to do this much per day? What's sort of your structure for all of this?
Yeah, I think it's going to be based like more on chance and just like whoever really comes our way. On the previous trip, for 4,000 miles of portraits, it was like most of it was actually people who approached me just because of what I was talking about before, about like how we're riding this bike that's like a conversation starter, and people just ask me so many questions. So a lot of the times it was just like based on chance, which was great. And I think during this trip, we're actually going to be lowering our daily mileage just so that we like have time to document everything and we're not rushing.
Yeah, I think that's a big lesson from doing the Trans Am together is one, and we haven't gotten all the specific details out, but one, trying to put a break. We can kind of catch up on all the work that we may have fallen behind on, 2 weeks into the trip or 3 weeks into hopefully a 5-week trip in total. But then having those short days. But then Annalisa and I have also talked about planning in those days where we say, let's just go ride our bikes. And maybe we take fewer photographs or fewer videos that day and just enjoy the scenery. I think as a travel photographer, videographer, you kind of learn to balance that in a better way.
I wonder if you're going to have more success in running into people in the more populated areas versus the less populated areas. But in some ways, I kind of want you guys to run into some truly random people in some truly wildernessy areas. Do you have any kind of thoughts about the types of people that you might be meeting, or are you just going to kind of let it come as it is?
No, you never know who you're going to meet. I'm fascinated. I mean, Annalisa and I are both from, well, she's in Brooklyn right now, and I'm in New Jersey, but we're both from the metropolitan area. And so as you touched on a little bit earlier, we're very used to people having this 9-to-5 job that's in an office and kind of structured in that way. And so at least in my kind of fantasy of Alaska, meeting people who might do more fishing or do more hunting or work with the land more directly. I think that would be incredible to discover.
I assume that you guys have kind of a route all figured out, because Alaska's not exactly one of those things where you can just say, I think I'm going to go this direction, because there's only a limited number of roads that you can do 1,000 miles on. What's sort of the beginning of your trips looking like? I assume like Anchorage or one of the kind of cities you can fly into, and where are the parts of the state that you're most excited about?
So we're going to do 2 loops out of Anchorage. So first we're going to bike out of Anchorage up to Fairbanks via Denali National Park. So hopefully we can squeeze in a hike in there, because we'd love to see Denali. And then we're going to loop back around via the Denali Highway, which I think is more of a gravel road. So we have to look into that, because we're going to have touring bikes. But then we're going to go back down to Anchorage and then bike down to Homer and then to Kodiak Island and then back.
Do you have any thoughts about going super far north, like above this Arctic Circle or anything like that? Or are you going to be able to get the miles out of those 2 loops?
I think we're getting the miles out of those 2 loops, but we're still pretty open if anyone has any suggestions, because it seems like it would be cool to go to the Arctic Circle.
Some of the more interesting stories that I've ever heard about are the folks doing the Dalton, and they end up in Prudhoe Bay, and just the prospect of talking to people who live up there and work up there. It's just got to be a really interesting, isolated place. And, I think a lot of interesting stories could come out of that. But then again, that's in context with the rest of Alaska, which is fairly isolated and whatever, especially for those of us who live in, East Coast American cities. Everywhere in Alaska is frontier land, even maybe a little bit of Anchorage. So I understand you mentioned it before, Annalisa, that you've got a Kickstarter set up for the support for the ride. What are some of the cool rewards? The fun part, I like to fast forward. What are the cool rewards that the supporters get for supporting the film and all of the stuff that you've got set up for this?
Sure. So for $15, you can get kind of a sneak peek at the film and a digital download of the magazine. And then for, $20, you get the physical magazine, which should be coming out around November, so in time for the holidays. And then $90 gets you a 3-print photo series. And then we also have sponsor levels.
Oh, that's really cool.
So we're currently trying to get some sponsorship.
For the photo series, is it going to be a selection of people that you choose, or is it that the donor picks out? How does that work?
I think the donor could be able to pick them out depending on how many backers we get for it.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. And you were saying before we started recording that Kickstarter made you, what was it, a favorite project, something very cool where I think you're getting more exposure. I think that's awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, we just got an email about that yesterday, just saying that they're going to feature us on the homepage and throughout the website, which is really exciting.
That's really cool. Well, I'm super excited to hear about this adventure. I'm really excited to be seeing the portraits that'll be coming out. I assume that you're not going to be kind of doing this on the fly so much, because I know connectivity is a bit of a challenge up there. What's your release schedule looking like for the website?
Yeah, I think we'll be trying to release as much as we can while we're there, when we're kind of base camping in Anchorage and when we have connection, of course. But then we'll definitely be uploading everything else once we get home in August.
Lots of cool stuff for people to look forward to. milesofportraits.com, if I'm not mistaken. Is that the website?
Yes, that's where you can see all the portraits from previous trips and where we'll be updating the Alaska portraits. If you want to support the Kickstarter, it's milesofportraits.com/Kickstarter. So that's the easy link for it.
That is awesome, because I think that a lot of people who are listening to the show might be interested in supporting this and also getting some of those cool reward levels that you've got for such a really cool and interesting project. Because, Alaska is sort of out of reach for some of us, but you guys are going to make it happen. So I'm super excited that you get to do this adventure and then document it all for everyone. That's just great. Erik and Annalisa, thank you so much for being on the show, and good luck to you in your adventures.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
I really appreciate it.
Big thanks to Annalisa and Erik again for joining the show. Just one more quick plug for them, milesofportraits.com. You can find all the information there, read more about the last trip, see all the different cool portraits that are there, that it's part of that project. And I'm just really excited to envision the types of folks that they're going to meet in Alaska to add on to the wonderful cavalcade of that's not a word. Cavalcade of people. That is a word that they met on the original trip. And I think that it's going to be a really cool addition to all of this, plus the film, plus all those other things. If you want to support it, they've got a Kickstarter, and I invite you to check that out as well. One more reminder that we will be back with episode 123 in a few days. That will be continuing the series on the Katy Trail Pedalshift Tour Journals Volume 10. It will be chapter 4, day 4 of the ride. A really interesting day that led into some more interesting days. We'll be going through days 4, 5, and 6 to close out the series. And I haven't decided yet whether day 6 will be the last one or we'll get kind of a chapter 7 sum up. It just sort of depends on how things shake out. We'll see how all that goes, but that's going to be basically the programming for the remainder of the month of June. We'll continue to do 2 episodes a week until we run out of Katy Trail to talk about, and then we'll go back to our weekly format. But I'm really glad that I've been able to kind of share this with all of you. I'm really glad that you all have been enjoying it, but just you wait. There's some big stuff coming. And we like to end off the show, as always, with a big thank you to the supporters of the show who are members of the Pedalshift Society. If you like what you hear, you can help maintain Pedalshift as an independent, listener-supported voice while expanding the offerings. We're talking $1, $2, $5 a month. Helps with the cost of hosting the podcast and the website. You can do it for a bit and cancel anytime. One-shot support is welcome as well. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Ethan Georgi, Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lien, Andrew MacGregor, Michael Hart, Josiah Matthews, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Seth Krieger, Marco Lowe, Terrance Manson, Noah Schroer, Harry Telgadas, John Sikorski, Richard Killian, Chris Barron, Brian Hren, Mark Van Raam, Brad Hipwell, Paul Mulvey, Stuart Buchan, Todd Stutz, Mr. T, Roxy Arning, Nathan Poulton, Harry Hugel, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Ruth Divorcey, Michelle Miller, Matthew Lewis, Michael Baker, Billy Crafton, Paul Culbertson, Scott Culbertson, Matt Perry, Danielle Jepson, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Bobby Ruppel, Roy Everett, Greg Braithwaite, John Mayer, William Cairns, Sandy Pizzio, Richard Patch, Mark Messer, and new this month, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, and Dave Roll. And thanks also to all past contributors and anonymous contributors for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.